introduction, Chris, and thanks for saving, in an incredible day of panels and speakers, thanks for saving the best for last. And thank you all for staying. I hope you'll continue to indulge me or humor me just for a few minutes. I want to share a personal experience. I finished medical school in 2004, and after I finished medical school, went on to do an internship at Harbor UCLA Medical Center in Southern California. I vividly recall my internship, and that might be because it was an incredible learning experience. It might be because of the spectacular weather, like the day we're having today. And it might also be because of the incredible amount of administrative burden, or as we called it in those days, scut work. And you know, I sought to be a really outstanding intern. And therefore wanted to come in early and be very prepared on my patients to be able to present to my senior residents and attending physicians. And so a typical day would sort of start in the wee hours of the morning, rounding, seeing patients. And then after seeing the patient, going to look in their chart. And in those days, we had paper charts. And so the immediate challenge was going to the chart rack, which was numbered with the patient rooms, and trying to actually obtain the chart. So the first challenge was finding the chart, as often the chart was not in the chart rack, but it might take a few minutes or maybe even longer to actually find the chart. And oftentimes, I thought that some staff might be purposefully misplacing the charts to have some fun with us. And so once I found the chart, though, the next task was to digest the information in that chart, including the vital signs, summarize it, and put it into my own note. Now let's fast forward to 2018. And as we heard in the first session of today, over 90% of hospitals are now on electronic health records. And so that's had the immediate impact of eliminating the hunt for the chart. I can now, clinicians, nurses, everyone that has appropriate access to the record can get access at any computer station and even from home. And we are also fortunate at Partners to have biomedical device integration. So many of our physiologic monitors are networked. Those data elements stream to our EHR. Our nurses have the opportunity to validate those physiologic data elements and approve appropriate data elements to be included directly into the EHR. And so now the experience for the intern is the intern can wake up in the wee hours of the morning, but still be in their pajamas at home. They can check their patient list in the EHR. They can even gather the vitals electronically, automatically, with the click of a button by generating a rounding report. And so very clearly, we have made the intern's day much more efficient, and we have allowed the intern to now focus on learning instead of scut work. This has also had dramatic efficiency implications for medical assistants and for nursing staff. And so we've clearly replicated the intern workflow, and now there's opportunities to surpass and augment that by improving visualization and by adding machine learning algorithms to contribute to clinical decision support. So in this panel, we're going to talk about how artificial intelligence can improve hospital operations. And I've just shared with you one example, and now I'd like to give the panelists an opportunity to introduce themselves and share a little bit about their work in this area. Sandy?
Thanks, Adam. It is incredibly exciting to be on this panel with these panelists in front of this audience talking about this topic. We see in our clinical departments an ever-increasing number of cases where partners identify new forms of data and new algorithms that have the potential to truly transform the way that they care for patients. But the problem is, as has been discussed so often in this conference, that clinical processes are incredibly resistant to change. So it is very difficult to get these new data and these new algorithms deployed and in use. So what our group does is it focuses on building smart on-fire apps that not only expose these data and these algorithms to clinicians, but also enable the clinical process transformations by providing the new IT support required to actually get them into use. In addition to that, we also are building an open source health innovation platform that is focused on making it cheaper and more efficient to build, secure, validate, deploy, share, and ultimately network these applications across institutions. So we're really focused on this last mile problem associated with enabling the clinical process transformations required to get algorithmic enabled care more broadly rolled out in healthcare.
Thanks, Sandy. AG?
Yeah, so a lot of you know Optum. We're sort of a sprawling organization with a lot of hands, feet, fingers, toes, lots of tentacles out there. So my job was to sort of try to crystallize our thoughts about AI into a few simple themes. And we're really focused in 3 areas from an AI perspective. One, stupid stuff that humans shouldn't keep doing. That's probably a recurrent theme today. Prior auth and fun stuff like that. I think that's fairly obvious. The less obvious areas of focus are places where there are not enough humans. And in that, we actually have been focused on behavioral health. There just are not enough therapists. There are not enough resources to deal with the behavioral issues. And then the third, less obvious place is actually places where you can't have a human all the time when you need them. And the part we're focused on there is really very forward-leaning diagnostics. And I don't mean the kind of conclusive diagnostics that you get a full workup when you go to the Brigham, but we're talking about how do we find patients early in illness. How do we monitor them in the home? How do they triage them? How do we get them to the right place at the right time to interact with the healthcare system in the best way? And AI is a particularly good modality to sort of be aware and sentient and working in sort of the all-time, everyday circumstances that most patients find themselves. So for us, those are, at least for now, the 3 areas that we're most excited about.
Great, thank you, AG. Neil.
Thanks, Adam. Neil Crescenzo, CEO of Change Healthcare. We provide software and analytics, medical network, and related services to help our customers, both payers and providers, improve quality, reduce costs, and create really a more connected healthcare ecosystem. We're focused really on 2 areas, again, which we've heard a lot about at this conference. One is around clinical decision support, and the other is around financial and administrative decision support, where we use AI in order to basically take complexity out of the process, provide greater continuity of care and greater expertise brought to some parts of the healthcare system that don't necessarily have all the resources and capabilities that Boston in particular is quite fortunate to have. And it really inspires all the 15,000 or so people in our company to get up every day to really help do our part in improving healthcare. We heard a lot at this conference about data and training algorithms and understanding how to use data and different types of data, whether the data is clean, whether it's curated, et cetera. Just to give you an idea on scale, we process about $2 trillion of the $3 trillion in the U.S. healthcare system. So like many of the people you've heard here at this conference, we take that responsibility seriously, and it gives us some unique opportunities to help people across the entire healthcare spectrum.
Incredible. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for having me on the panel. Adam, I'm Mudit Garg. I'm one of the founders and CEO of Qventus. We have a product that uses machine learning and AI to help hospitals and clinics manage their operations in real time and at scale. Work with health systems across the US and a few in Canada as well, ranging from academics to community hospitals to safety net hospitals. Across the board, some of the common problems we've worked on have ranged from issues like managing the flow of patients and throughput in the emergency department or the operating room to managing length of stay. But the similar approaches have also seen a lot of good results in areas like managing pharmacy operations, as well as improving outpatient access. For me, Adam, you were sharing the story of what prompted you to go down this path and being excited about this journey on applying AI towards operations. For me, that started about 10 years ago. Was fortunate to start working within the hospitals in the operations space, helping improve, and very quickly started seeing that it wasn't that we didn't have world-class clinicians or world-class equipment or world-class therapies available. It often was the case that everything else that went around it was actually behind the times. Every department I went to where there was a frontline manager who went above and beyond, anticipated operational issues, got ahead of them, got a bunch of people activated around it, Cost was good, quality was good, access was good, but it was really, really hard to sustain that level of superhuman effort. Every single decision operationally took that kind of anticipation and effort, and my hope and inspiration was to see if there's a role for technology to play, and specifically data to play, in making that anticipation as effortless as possible.
Great, thanks, Mudit. Lisa.
My name is Lisa Mackie. I'm the co-founder of PokitDok. I had the unusual experience today of realizing that I've been working in technology for almost 30 years. Starting at Microsoft in 1989, where I worked in DOS and turned on had to totally turn off and return on my computer at least 3 times a day. And then moved into Windows, wrote some of the first programs for Windows-based product. It was all shrink-wrapped. Worked on the team that invented Wizards when they still did something. Moved into the internet in the 90s. Was brought back to Microsoft after a hiatus to start working with big data on a project post-Katrina and the tsunami to try to help the first responders share data securely. And now I'm seeing my 3rd major revolution in the technology industry with what's happening with AI, machine learning, and blockchain. I love how Adam started us out, because after working in technology that long, I don't really like talking about it, but I really like talking about the why. I decided to create a company in healthcare because I had a health problem, like a lot of technologists who do. I have synovial cysts on my lumbar spine, which I got from rowing and teaching snowboarding. It took me 6 months to diagnose it correctly, because there's downward pressure, pricing pressure on MRIs, which is the only way you can diagnose it accurately. And once diagnosed, it took me another 6 months to figure out how to treat it non-surgically, because that's the clinical pathway to treat synovial cysts. Finally, by putting my MRIs on Facebook, after a year, I got an answer in an hour. So that is not a knock against any of my caregivers, who were all doing a great job. They were all excellent caregivers and doing the best that they could to help me. It was because, as has been discussed, the underlying systems that I was depending on to get me the information I needed are circa 1998. Pre-internet, pre-mobile, did not anticipate consumer-driven transactions or searches at scale. So that's why I personally got involved. We started on the business side of healthcare. Our objective was to rebuild the business transaction infrastructure from scratch, to modernize it, put it in the cloud, build all the connections to insurance companies, PBMs, and others the way they expect to see it, the data formats they currently use, and transform that into software services and tools that software developers and people like partners can use to build new patient access models, new business models, new searches. So that's why I got involved.
Great, thank you all for sharing your experiences. There's a lot of hype around AI. Would a few of you be willing to share an example where you've implemented an AI solution and had a positive ROI or a positive impact? Anyone? Go ahead, Neil.
Sure. I mean, I think it's been discussed here. There's, I love that quote from Bill Gibson, the science fiction writer, "The future's arrived, it's just unequally distributed." Yeah. And there's, little pockets, I think, of great examples. In clinical decision support, we do a lot of work with our InterQual products around utilization management. And so this is a business that's been around ever since somebody said, gee, do they really need that procedure? And it's something that's, part and parcel of US healthcare, at least, a little bit different in other countries. And so we've spent the past couple years basically trying to create that into an infomated, automated, AI-based process. And essentially, if you can imagine, those of you on the provider side, I'm sure are well aware of this, or anybody on the payer side who deals with the other side of this, these used to be books, then they were CD-ROMs, then they were separate software programs. In part with a company we bought a little while ago called the National Decision Sciences Corporation, we've now integrated that into the electronic medical records, which many of you, of course, use, where the data gets picked up automatically, it's analyzed for the utilization management criteria, sent to the payer, and essentially it auto clears. Now you're going to say, gosh, that's a pretty mundane utilization of technology, but utilization management, at least I don't think anybody quite yet thinks that's going to completely go away. We actually produced a press release with an academic medical center, I guess about 6 months ago. And if any of you have tried to get a press release from an academic medical center, it's not a simple process. But they were so excited about this, they were kind enough to talk about it publicly. And they basically, if you want to think about that as a utilization management transaction now done through information rather than typically the people who didn't necessarily be part of the process, they automated 30% of those transactions. And so if you just think about a process that, again, is somewhat mundane perhaps in some people's minds, but critically important to the functioning of the healthcare system, I'm not sure anybody knows exactly how many people work in utilization management on the payer and provider side, at least in this country. No one's ever argued if I say it's at least 100,000 people. We actually do know the average salary, because somebody did a survey on this, of people who work in UM. It's about $80,000 a year. So that's about $8 billion spent on managing that process. So if you thought about, gee, what if we could take 30% of those people and free them up to go work on other things, many of them are nurses and other caregivers, that's $2.4 billion right there. And so this is not something that's science fiction, a Bill Gibson quote notwithstanding. It actually occurs today. But as somebody also said earlier, I think a lot of the peer-reviewed journal articles have looked at technology transfers, say it takes 10 years, 15 years, or longer to have technologies, even ones that seem pretty much common sense, diffuse through the healthcare system. And we're now on that journey, but I think it's a good example of where some of the low-hanging fruit is even starting to be plucked.
Thanks, Neil. Others with examples, low-hanging fruit, Mudit, and then...
Yeah, I think that was a great example. I love oftentimes looking for examples that are the boring, uncool examples that no one thinks about, but actually are practical today. So for us, we work with health systems and many such problems as well. One example specifically is length of stay. As you know, length of stay in the acute setting specifically is probably the biggest indicator of affordability of being able to have service in that setting. It's also, from a profitability standpoint, the ability to survive in a Medicare patient profitably is very, very highly correlated with that. But it's a really tough problem. For decades, we've been trying to reduce that. We made gains, but it's a pretty hard problem given the number of stakeholders. We've seen recently about, in a single facility, about 15,000 excess stays taken out, which is with the same resources, about 2,500 patients more treated. Or another way looked at it, about $1,000 knocked off the cost of providing care to each patient coming through that facility, which is amazing. The way that happens is, again, these little decisions that superhuman frontline manager was anticipating. That patient is going to go to a SNF. Let me not wait till day 5 and figure that out. Let me see what I can do. Those things and building that anticipation into the point that it's effortless. Seen that similarly in taking about 1 million patient minutes in a small hospital in Fort Smith, Arkansas, out of the wait times in the emergency department, or creating access in the outpatient clinic. So all of those use cases in my mind have the same thread, that some human, if they had the time and energy to look at it, pause, and just do it, they could have gotten at it. But we have so many of those things that they need to do. How about we make it effortless or easier for them to do that and free them up to do and focus elsewhere? So those are some examples for us as well.
Great, thank you. AG.
Yeah, we made an investment in a company that's actually right across the street. I will not make this a shameless pitch and name them, but the problem as we saw it was a lot of our patients were going to Dr. Google and scaring the crap out of themselves. And raise your hand if you've ever done that, right? It's a $50 billion problem for us. Because you have overuse of emergency rooms, you have underuse of primary care, misuse, et cetera. And a lot of folks sort of put the use case at sort of reproduce a primary care physician's diagnostic capability. And we didn't actually see it that way, although the results were quite good and pretty much almost dead on with what primary care does, about 90% accuracy. But our goal was to get folks better information than they could get through Google. And what's been amazing is watching the uptake from a patient perspective. The company went from 80,000 users to 2 million users in 9 months, and is now on track in the next year to do 40 million users. So it was about intercepting Google as the first point of contact. So the point is, AI is out there. It's crappy AI that people are using in all sorts of consumer contexts. And so it's about bringing better, more clinically validated, more rigorous data with algorithms behind them to places where people otherwise wouldn't know to look. And so that for us was a terrific place. The other place we're doing it is in behavioral, as I mentioned. Behavioral is a place where the parameterization of behavioral measurement is very difficult because we have to haul a patient in, make them do some cognitive behavioral test in an office where they, push on keys or do other sorts of tests. It doesn't, fluorescent lights, it's an office, it doesn't in any way measure our day-to-day behavioral sort of trajectory. So getting AI and ML out onto phones and devices, et cetera, to start to, in the ecological circumstance, measure 24/7 behavioral parameters really is a completely new way to even understand performance, human performance from a cognitive behavioral perspective, and then tie that to behavioral health management. So these for us are very powerful and very important places where we can deploy this, and it's been successful.
And I just extend on the idea that often the key is the algorithm itself. And as Anne mentioned yesterday, machine learning is a part of algorithmic driven care, but not the entire area of algorithmic driven care. So we're seeing algorithms really making a difference in how we take platelets and make sure that we don't burn them through HLA mismatches in bone marrow transplants, enabling new forms of management for patients with high lipids, heart failure, hypertension, by enabling algorithm-backed navigators to do a much better job helping them optimize their drug dosing and drug selection, as well as really scanning our patient populations to look for patients who should be treated in a particular clinic, for example, an inherited heart disease clinic that we may not have identified so far.
Great. And to the audience, please feel free to submit questions via the mobile app. We've just heard several tangible applications of using AI to improve hospital operations, from length of stay to getting patients to use a different application instead of Dr. Google. But often it's more than just using the technology. It's about implementation. It's about culture change and change management. How do you deal with those barriers in actually being successful with your AI interventions?
Well, maybe I'll talk to that.
Go ahead, Lisa.
As the small member selling into the large institutions, I was very much struck by Dr. Gawandi's statement today about readiness, because I think as an early stage company, one of the things that we don't have a lot of power around, but we could do a better job of, is understanding the readiness of our enterprise partners in working with us to implement our technologies. For example, most of the technology, we're talking a lot about AI, but most of the technology necessary to solve most of the problems we've talked about today has existed for quite a while, at least a decade. But pulling it all together and overcoming some of these barriers has been prohibitive. And for example, scheduling, online scheduling in real time, being able to assess someone's financial responsibility at the time of scheduling, taking a payment if they haven't met their deductible, and submitting a claim for credit for a self-pay payment to their insurer is all possible today. The barrier is that a vast majority of health systems don't know who you are when you show up to their digital doorway, and they don't know, if once identified, they don't know who you are across each of their back-end systems, their registry, their practice management system, and each implementation of a particular EMR. So as a young technology company, we had the scheduling implementation down, but we didn't realize we had to solve the identity problem until we had signed the contract. That can be death to an early stage company. We survived it, but that's, I think the point of that is no one did anything wrong, but established readiness. understand all pieces of the pathway that have to be solved as we're going down these new technical solutions. Because they're solvable, but they will take time.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say that's really insightful. I think the AI machine learning by itself is a critical component, but actually I think that's going to get commoditized soon enough, if not in more than 2 to 3 years. It's really the operationalization of that machine learning and AI. That is the most important piece. And we learned the lesson the hard way. 2013, 14 is when I talked to a lot of health system leaders and said, why is it that it's so hard to operate consistently and reliably in a healthcare setting? And a lot of them pointed to the fact that half my patients are unscheduled, what resources a patient needs is unknown. I have a highly people-driven business. If you could just predict, we'd be able to adapt, we'll be able to be prepared and get ahead of it. So biased as being a statistical signal processing guy, I was like, yes, that's the answer. I'm going to apply machine learning to this problem and it'll all be good. So it was 2013, we started doing predictions in a mother-baby unit of providing census, of how much your census is going to be the next day. I used to go out every day and ask the charge nurse how it was. And one day I knew we had nailed it, so I was really excited. I went and asked her, how were the predictions? And she said they were fine. I was like, I thought we were spot on at 2 p.m. Like, what happened? How come you're not more excited? She said, honestly, I had 5 seconds to look at it. And what if it was wrong? What if it was right? If I called people in and they weren't there and we didn't need them? And she gave me this example, this joke at the end. She said, a prediction's a distribution, but if I'm driving and I have a ton of cognitive load and someone told me 30% chance to take a left, 40% chance to take a right, I would toss it out the window. I don't have time to think through it. Just tell me what I should do. I may not agree with you, and learn from it. And that was a very, very foundational lesson for us as a company to say, my job is not to predict. My job is to predict, figure out the cost, the benefit, say turn right, and then do it in a way that persuades you to take action. You don't have to log into a system, figure it out, and do more work. Our job is the entirety of the pipeline to get to the action. And I think that is a really, really core component. And to do that, you need to have readiness. You need to understand what is the workflow of what people are doing. It's not a data problem. You have to figure out where data exists. Is it clean? Can I predict? If I can predict, will it lead to a workflow change that I can do something about? Are people used to doing that workflow? If they do it, is it an outcome that is worth going and solving? The entirety of that pipeline has to be solved and not just the ML and the AI.
Yeah, I really strongly agree with this. What we find is if we want to introduce a change into the care delivery process, we have to be able to save people time because everyone is flat out. So you have to be able to save them time. And often that means building support beyond the specific, algorithmic-based prediction or support that you're introducing to make other parts of their process easier to do. But even when you do that, you still have this problem of activation energy. It speaks to readiness because the clinicians have to work with you to define the new workflow, and then they have to validate that workflow, often site by site, before they implement. So if they are totally flat out, it's difficult for them to reach that activation energy, even if they know that it's going to save them time immediately after they do so. And I think that this has a really interesting implication for many people in the audience, because I believe that what this means is that often it will be easier to introduce these changes. It will be easier to introduce radical changes that involve new redefined workflows that interject new stakeholders and new actors than it will be to make incremental changes to existing workflows using existing personnel.
I'm seeing a lot of, go ahead, Neil.
I was going to say, in addition to the activation, there are just some institutions or healthcare providers, let's say in particular, who just don't have the resources. One of the things that we find is we've got a bunch of data and we've got some algorithms and processes that could be, for example, consumed into an open source platform for an institution that already has the activation and the readiness and the capabilities to consume it, or software and analytics, like the example that Mudit gave. But then, we have other customers who are basically like, you know what, I really don't have the time or the resources or the expertise. I need you to fish for me, and maybe fish for me only for a while or maybe forever, but if I'm gonna actually get this benefit, it doesn't matter that everybody's flat out. Even if I freed them up, they don't have the expertise. So we've seen an incredible surge over the past few years in taking over patient access for large, particularly urban academic medical centers. Because a lot of these places have grown. They've got 50, 75, 100 ambulatory offices all over the community. And if you start thinking about the patient experience, you want a consistent patient experience that's informed by their preferences, all the AI and machine learning stuff that we've talked about at this conference, but you're not one of the larger, more sophisticated institutions, like certainly this one and others that are represented generally, let's say, in a city like Boston. I mean, that's really not even practical for them to do so. So I think one of the things that we're seeing is that for some folks, they're not even going to try readiness and activation. They're going to say, do this for me, and maybe 2 years from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, I'll decide to take it in-house. But if I'm going to take advantage of these skills, I need to have somebody to help me do it. And that may mean I just basically give it to somebody else to do and get most of the benefit, even if it's not perfect. And I think for a lot of institutions that don't have the resources or the sophistication, that may be their quickest way to get benefits from some of this technology.
I think that's a really interesting point that you make, Neil, because many industries now using SaaS-based products, which is completely built for that scenario where it's not core to your business to do that particular function like patient access, but you desperately need it to do business. And you should be able to just subscribe and download software and use it day one. But because the underlying infrastructure, business infrastructure of healthcare is not programmable, and we've heard that more than once today, I think it was on the genomics panel, it's very difficult to connect those ready-made solutions to your existing stack unless you're working with someone who's already part of that existing stack. So it's a barrier. It's one that we can work through, and it will take time. PokitDok also has a patient access solution that we can stand up in a couple weeks at most, but it still takes time to integrate it with the EMR. That's the longest part. Or for the provider to find their merchant account number so we can deposit the funds. That usually takes a couple weeks to find.
So, and this is kind of a bold question from the audience, but given the challenges that you're describing, and given Sandy's sort of argument or assertion that maybe we should be being even more bold and not looking to just take small steps, but make big changes. Should we be trying to do this in existing hospitals, even existing academic health centers? Or should we be looking to new ventures entirely, where Neil was going? Or maybe folks like Amazon or CVS and Aetna? So where do you think the focus should be?
Yeah, we like areas of stored kinetic energy. And one of the places that we find the most stored kinetic energy right now is consumer frustration. That is just seething, quite frankly. The patient satisfaction with the healthcare system ranks up there with the prison system. So in that context, and the fact that we now have $1,200, $1,000 of self-pay, and a very information aggressive cohort of young people starting to age into their first experience with illness, is driving a lot of big change. Move out of the classical sort of guild model of healthcare and towards a more self-diagnostic, self-guided experience or demand for an experience, as well as payment, access to scheduling, the whole nine, the ability to market their own data, the demand for value back for their own data, and understanding of what that data means. They're so far out in front of us that we may never see anything but the ass end of them. So, when you think about what's happening with blockchain, if you talk about healthcare, if you really look at healthcare broadly, besides like surgery and molecules, it's all data. It's all data. And once you start to break it down at that level and you start to put that data out into new environments, you open up an entirely new place where healthcare can happen. And that, I think, is going to happen faster than people actually ever expect. And it's going to happen before you even understand that it's already happened.
It's going to happen on the edges.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's exactly right. That's
Yeah.
exactly right.
And it's blockchain, if you take the name blockchain away and think about it, it is describing the movement you're talking about where activity is happening on the edges of a network where, dare I say it, what the functions that Neil's company and my company does are not technically necessary. And all actors in that network can exchange information with each other seamlessly as needed. The data is secure, more secure probably than any of the data that we're operating on today. I want to make one note. You're least likely to get hacked or have a security breach with AI, more likely a device you don't know about within your hospital walls, but we can talk more about that later. But this is coming. The activity is happening on the edges. It will be driven by the younger people, and they are going to pull us out of our current behaviors and systems.
I also think, though, on the flip side, like I think the problem and the amount of cost that is going into the existing system is so huge. We can't afford to hope that only the outside pull will happen. So I think that balance is really important. So one of the reasons I think the question was, why not focus on that? I think we absolutely have to transform ourselves, how we deliver care. To transform ourselves, we also have to, in the meantime, figure out how to create efficiency in the existing business model so we have the capital and the ability and the time to transform ourselves. So I think that balance is both needed. And boy, like, honestly, in healthcare, you could pick any problem, and if you can meaningfully solve it, whether you come in outside in, inside out, you'll make a huge change, a transformational change. So I think it almost is immaterial to some extent.
Yep.
Yeah.
And to your point, it's to save time. We can't make physicians and practitioners work harder.
Absolutely.
They're already, as you say, flat out.
Absolutely.
So focus on how can we save them time.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I totally agree that this transformation could happen much faster than we expect it to. When you move to algorithmically based care, then you can totally transform, you can totally refactor the care delivery process and move where that care happens and who's involved in that care. But I do think that the question had a false dichotomy relative to this fast movement and the question of where that occurs and what institutions it occurs in, because I do think that the hospital systems, there is quite a bit of expertise within those systems to understand what ideal clinical workflows look like and how they transform. So I think that hospitals will also be moving very quickly to implement these new models while new entrants come in to challenge us.
Yeah, I think, Adam, for Sandy's point, we go through the sort of build, measure, learn, lean startup process for new. We actually try to have 3 partners, perfect world, maybe a very successful large academic medical center, because I think, Mudit's point, that's where a lot of care is being delivered today. Then, look at a community-based system, which is going to have different priorities. And then maybe, I don't know, probably a number of people here know Amir Rubin in One Medical or Consti. I mean, those are very different models. But I think we build platforms. So if you're going to build a platform for a very complex, heterogeneous system, you're going to have different parties that are part of it, or you're really going to limit yourself to one area or another. But it is tough for the dichotomy that you described where, which is the best way to go. And if you're going to really try to help the healthcare system, you're going to have to build platforms for a system. It means it takes longer, it's not easy, but I think in the end it provides more value to the overall system.
I think the question is what the system is going to be. The system was always a physical instantiation of a building with people in it and data in whatever form, paper, now electronic. That's just a centralization of knowledge base, and it's the ability to deal with nuance in a circumstance where you can get sort of a multivalent picture of what's going on. That's totally virtualizable, except in the laying on of hands. Right? And so that's the place where those pieces will get carved off, I think, faster than people realize, because that convenience of a place is no longer the best place for the patients to get what they need. It was always the best place for practitioners to get what they wanted. And that's what's changing, and that's the frustration that we see sort of fueling that transformation.
I have to agree. I
Go ahead.
just want to add to that. We're like the gnat to to change his elephant, but we do have over 700 companies, both early stage and enterprise, using our platform because it is open and they can just show up, sign up for an account, get up and running in as little as 2 hours with medical and pharmacy eligibility running. And the kinds of companies that we're seeing show up to do that are all the edges. They're all the new patient experience models. They're telehealth, they're genomics, they're new testing models. And what they're focused on is consumer experience and being able to design that consumer experience as they think it should be and test and change it as quickly as they possibly can. And for that, and I totally support your comments about platforms, you have to have open platforms that allow that kind of quick prototyping and experimentation. And that's, and they are there. We're seeing who's living and dying out there. And it is changing very, very quickly, to AG's point.
So building on both of your comments, AG and Lisa, what ultimately does the hospital of the future look like as we move to more automation and more AI?
Well, so one thing that we're seeing is a decoupling of non-acute procedures from the acute model and running those on different business models. So that's something that we're seeing succeed, where a lot of other efforts are failing. We're seeing both early stage and enterprise companies that are investing in those kinds of consumer-facing models succeeding well and growing. So that's one thing that I definitely see more of.
Other observations? Go ahead, Mudit.
Yeah, if I almost thought of it as what does the care delivery of the future look like, whether it's in the hospital, the clinic, virtual, or elsewhere. I think about, I shared with you earlier, like Jeff Bezos' letter last year talked about how the impact of AI and machine learning, while is often looked upon as the Alexa and the cool applications, a lot of it is fundamentally and meaningfully making changes to the operations day to day. And the way the change is, for example, if I'm ordering something and they know in this zip code the likelihood 8 out of 10 times we'll need more inventory happening here, it makes the consumer experience magical. With the same resources, with the same FedEx and the same UPS delivering it, comes faster and cheaper. Mm-hmm. I think there's so much value in our healthcare operations we can unlock, where, again, it's not left to someone to realize that, but these basic blocking and tackling are constantly happening continuously in a way that the system is best prepared for the dynamic situation that's going to develop for it. So, for example, I was talking to you about earlier, like in the ED, should we wait till the admit order is given to look for the bed? Can we do that in the first 15 minutes? In the outpatient situation, do I have to go know someone in the clinic to fit me into the right place where it causes the least disruption if the schedule is full, or can we do that automatically? So I think that hopefully the system of the future looks like one where I don't need to know someone for the best situation to be made out of what the constraints are today, but that happens naturally, automatically, consistently, reliably, without requiring superhuman effort from some manager somewhere.
Yeah.
So at the risk of saying something deliberately provocative, the original hospitals, and everybody in this room probably knows, there were places where people went to die, right? They were hospices in their original format. Go to very old buildings in Europe and you can see their original format. It was the distal end. It was the last stop. We started to build care around that, and then we started to actually get those people well enough that they could go out for a little while, and then eventually they'd end up back in, and that would be the end. And the interesting thing, I think, is as we start to think about flipping the hospital model to one of managing health over time, that physical plant, if you will, changes dramatically. We see how much care moving into ambulatory spaces. We're now seeing hospital in the home models. Those hospital in the home models are all enabled by telehealth, algorithmic care, remote monitoring, et cetera. And that, when hospital to home first came out, the idea was peel off the low acuity. That actually is not succeeding. It's the high acuity patients that do better being in the home, being cared for, being in a familiar environment, et cetera. So the whole notion of the physical plant, I think, is literally starting to break apart. And that enables an entirely new sort of wellness and preemptive function. We don't have to wait for the patient to get sick and present themselves anymore and either get admitted or get managed by a physician. All of that can be backed up. Even our definition of illness diagnostically is based on the idea that a patient shows up with symptoms that they can recognize and know to go to the doctor to deal with. That's actually a fundamentally broken model. Illness usually ends up showing up way earlier. The patients just don't know it. And that's a sort of a synthetic artifact of the physical notion that we have.
I was going to say, I think AG said it earlier, where do you have to actually have the laying on of hands? My daughter is a surgical resident at FGH, so I hope surgery is going to happen in ORs for a while, at least as she goes through her career. But some of you may be familiar with Mercy's Virtua Health operation, and another good example where they figured out how to push a lot of inpatient care into virtual settings, including high acuity patients. And I think what's fascinating about that model is now they're advising other systems how to do it, because they don't have necessarily as much of the activation energy. The readiness isn't there. And they're basically saying, look, we need consulting, not from any one of the high quality, many famous consulting firms, including those resident here in Boston, but fellow practitioners who might be 3 or 5 years ahead of us on the journey, who can communicate well to my professionals as to how we could move faster or you could help us move on this journey. So I think it's going to be a mix, but again, there are pockets of examples throughout the U.S. healthcare system.
Yeah, I'd like to come back to a point made earlier about open systems and argue a different dimension of this. I think that there are actually two different futures that are potentially in front of us. And I think that the one that we experience is actually going to be heavily dependent on what the people in this room decide to do and the choices that we make. I think in one future, what happens is we take these tools, which I do think are going to be incredibly powerful. They may take time to develop, but they're going to be incredibly powerful, and we develop them based on traditional business models. And what that leads us to is, I believe, new infrastructure that does represent a substantial jump forward, lots of process innovation. But once that happens, I think that we wind up at a new plateau based on new proprietary systems that challenge the old proprietary systems, and innovation starts to slow down. The other potential future is we all put in the effort, and it's a significant amount of effort, to figure out how to fund, and there'll be a lot of funding that's needed to bring all of this about, how to fund the creation of this infrastructure based on more open business models, which will be often more complex, some would argue more risky. I do believe they also will be much more profitable. And if we can figure that out, then we wind up with a scenario where we can all innovate on top of each other's work, use as much open data as possible, and we start to be able to really think about the notion of a true broad-based continuous learning healthcare system with all of the amazing benefits that would bring to humanity. But I think that depends on as many of us as possible sort of standing up and advocating for these kinds of models that will require us more time to put in place.
I'm just glad that one of your futures didn't involve the term robot overlords.
So thank you, and that was a really nice summary. Thank you all for sharing your experiences, for how you're actively using AI and automation in hospitals today, and your vision for where we go. And clearly a lot of exciting work to come. Thank you so much.
Thank you.